Welcome back to this week's episode of Seeking Proof, Finding Grace. I'm your host, Ron Campbell, and this week, as with every week, I want to start off by reminding you of the most important truth in the entire universe. God loves you. Okay, so I want to address, a few weeks ago, I went back in and re-recorded episode 63, and I wanted to do so based on a comment that I had gotten from a viewer. And it was a very lengthy comment that a viewer had put in there. And unfortunately, when you re-record episodes, you lose those comments. So with apologies, I am going to quote from the viewer tonight a little bit. And I don't normally do this and respond to things in the comment section. So, this is a kind of a one shot at this. But I wanted to address this, and I wanted to address it because a comment that the viewer made really stuck with me. And in it, the viewer said this. And then again, this is on this first quote talking about Darwin as he addressed the issue of living missing links, okay? And I want to go back to episode 63 and expand on a few of those things like I promised that we would. But this was the comment that the viewer had made. And he said, he or she said, "Please read what Darwin said before and after these quotes. You go off as if he says nothing, but he does address these questions because he was bringing them up rhetorically. And if he's wrong, then I'm wrong. And nothing you said has convinced me that I should look into it further." I really want to encourage you as the viewer to dig a little bit deeper on this and maybe expand your horizons, expand your focus on this. Things have changed over the last 100 years especially. And where we see in areas like physics or cosmology or other areas of science, and especially also now in areas of biology and certainly the origin of life biology and looking at things like that, these are groundbreaking areas where scientific discoveries have simply turned old theories on their heads. And that's the problem that we have with Darwinian theory right now, is that the growth of scientific discovery has simply outpaced Darwin's theory and is increasingly proving it to be impossible. It's just not possible. And that's what we're going to see, in my opinion. But again, that's what we see as we look at this going forward. So I want to start by addressing this first quote of Darwin's and expanding on it. I didn't want the last episode, I didn't want episode 63 to go too long. And so I wanted to expand a little bit more on here. As I mentioned before, I'm going to read the quote, and then I want to read Darwin's defense of it, because I don't think Darwin does a very good job of walking through this. And again, this is an incredibly important point. Not only do we have the tree of life, which we know does not support his theory, and for the reader who wrote in, that should be enough right there for you to take a deeper dive. But I want to look at this one, this question of living missing links, because I think we gloss over this one oftentimes as being not as materially important as it is, because I think it is, and it's easy for all of us to understand why. So here was the quote. First, why, if species have descended from other species by fine graduations, do we not everywhere see innumerable transitional forms? Why is not all of nature in confusion instead of the species being as we see them well defined? Okay, so that was Charles Darwin. And he's recognizing this issue of living missing links. And it's not that we don't see anything that we could perhaps point to and say, well, there's a possible example. I think, the one that usually comes up online when you look this kind of stuff up, there's a fish that can kind of drag itself along in the mud. And you always see that picture of that fish, kind of a gross looking little fish. But that's the point that Darwin's critics were making is, okay, you got the one little fish. We knew about that back in the 1850s, since 1860s too. Where are all the others? We should see nature just in an absolute state of constant change and uproar. And Darwin attempts to put four answers on the table, and I don't think any of them actually, I think several of them actually hurt his argument. But let's talk about it together. Okay, so number one, and again, this is quoting from The Origin of Species. I believe that species come to be tolerably well-defined objects and do not at any one period present an inextricable chaos of and intermediate links. Okay, so what Darwin is trying to get to there is really at some point species just stop. That they reach a point where they're pretty well defined and they don't need to go any further is what he's getting at. That is a really interesting problem for his theory, because Darwin was oftentimes, and even admitted this in his book, was accused at times of giving natural selection godlike powers. Do you notice what he just did right there? Is that natural selection suddenly knows when to back off. It's like natural selection goes, well, people are about as good as they can possibly be, so we're just going to leave people alone. And we don't think we should keep evolving people for something better. Or, horses have got about as far as horses can go. Or dogs, I think dogs are good. Dogs, I can argue, are about as good as we can go. Dogs are great. But dogs have gotten about as far as they go, and we don't need to evolve them any further. Why would that be? How would natural selection, again, you have, again, the idea, modern evolutionary theory, random mutation and natural selection, why would they ever take a break and stop? Why couldn't our eyes get better? Why couldn't we develop the ability to fly or the ability to levitate or whatever else it might be? Why is it that we have suddenly stopped? And Darwin, the very first defense he puts out there, which I think is a condemnation of his theory, is, well, I think we reach a point where species are pretty good. Based on what? Natural selection is not smart enough to know that, again, unless we give it godlike qualities. So his first answer that he's really, I think, banking on doesn't really work. And his second answer, I think, is relatively weak as well. Well, intermediate forms die out very quickly. I get that. And we're going to spend a lot of time talking about that in the weeks to come. Because one of the questions we're going to have on the table is, can intermediate variations between species live long enough to get you from point A to point B? And I'm going to argue along the way they can't. But we'll talk about that in much more detail in the weeks to come. But we understand that intermediary species die out quickly. So intermediate variants, intermediate forms die out very quickly. I get that. But where are they? We don't see them, and we don't see them dying out quickly. And certainly they shouldn't be able to die out fast enough that they escape our observational powers. We should be able to see them. And the fact that they die out quickly, we understand that could happen. Again, another weakness for the theory. But where are they? Again, so it does not answer the question. I love his third answer, which his third answer is going back to the old drawing board. He goes to this one over and over and over again throughout his book. Well, the fossil record is imperfect. No, that's not an answer. That is, again, we're not talking about the fossil record that doesn't support you in the 1860s and still doesn't support you today. We're talking about living missing links. So saying that the fossil record will someday be better is not an answer to this. So his third answer is irrelevant. And that brings you into his last answer. And his last answer rambles on for quite a few pages. And he talks about, I think what it was ducks that live in an area where they're dry and they really don't need their webbed feet, and woodpeckers who live in areas without trees. And could this be an early beginning point for evolution? This is one of those which came first, the chicken or the egg kind of thing. So you see a duck that moves into an area without water, but they haven't shed their webbed feet yet, but maybe they will. Maybe that's something that's going to happen later on down the road. Or maybe they're just in a dry area temporarily. Again, that doesn't really support, again, that the question was not, do we see places where someday we might eventually in millions of years come up with another evolutionary change? The question is, where are the changes that we could see happening now? Show us some changes, give us some proof. And you can't point to and say, well, you've got some woodpeckers that live in places with no trees. Okay, I get that. And I guess you could make the argument that maybe someday they won't need that hard beak anymore to be woodpeckers. That might be true, but again, that's not a living missing link. You're just making assumptions about which came first, the chicken or the egg. You have a fully developed bird. This is like saying when I go to the beach and I'm on vacation, if I'm swimming around a lot, am I in an early evolutionary change to eventually becoming Aquaman? No, I just went to the beach. So there's not really a good connection there that he's trying to pull together. So Darwin spends quite a few pages attempting to answer this question, but most of the time he's just kind of dodging around it, and he really never puts on the table a good supporting answer, in my opinion, that actually helps his case. And so again, when we look at this and we walk through it, I don't think Darwin really helps the case in here. So I didn't expand on it in the first video, which again, I have re-recorded, but I didn't spend this much time on it because I didn't want that first video to be massively long. But I wanted to go ahead and expand on it now in this video because honestly, I mean, Darwin does provide answers, yes, but his answers are not very good ones. So looking at that, I feel pretty justified that we can kind of move on from that one. And honestly, again, Darwin really doesn't address the problem terribly well. Now, the viewer pointed out, a lot of the complaints and concerns that I had about Java Man. And I wanted to be really clear about this because I think the first time I recorded this, I did not do a deep enough dive on Java Man, and I kind of want to walk through that here. And he provides an analogy for us, and I want to go through this with you because I, in fairness to the reader, I don't think it's a very good analogy, and we'll explain why, but I think it helps draw out the point of what's wrong with Java Man. Of course it was painted assuming that evolution is true. My criticism being is that the picture that's painted assumes evolution being true, and that's the only way you can get that picture from a skull cap, 3 teeth, and a thigh bone. You can't get that picture. Now, I have said, and my complaint is, looking back at G.K. Chesterton's quote, which we did back in episode 63, that Chesterton pointed out the same problem 100 years ago. You cannot, from the evidence that has been found, produce the picture that you've drawn. You just simply can't do it unless you assume that evolution is true and you fill in an enormous number of details that otherwise are not there. So that's my contention. Here's what the reader said. Of course it was painted assuming evolution is true. Depictions of the crucifix are crafted with Jesus on it. Is that at all a fair criticism to say? You're just assuming Jesus died on the cross. I know you'll say there are good reasons for it, but I'll say there's a good reason for the evolutionary artists and evolutionary scientists analyzing and depicting an evolutionary finding artistically that they would assume evolution would be true. On top of that, I'm not entirely sure they would have depicted it any other way under the assumption that evolution wasn't true. At least I hope not. I hope you're not expecting your sources to deliberately fudge findings to look more ape-like or human-like than the findings lend credit. Regardless, excuse me for not just taking your word for it. And he goes on to talk about a few more things than his quote. Okay. So that is exactly what I'm saying in this, that they have assumed by saying that evolution is true, that taking an enormous number of liberties with the picture that has been drawn. I'm not saying it's necessarily done on purpose. I'm saying, in looking at this, that the only way you get that picture from 3 teeth, a thigh bone, and a skull cap is by assuming that evolution is absolutely true and that these pieces fit into an overall larger puzzle. And the problem is we have to assume at every step along the way that all of these things are true with remarkably little evidence many of the times. Not all the time, I'll grant you, but many of the time. So for example, if you look at the nose on Java Man, which portion was it? Which find was it that gives you the shape of the nose? Was it the 3 teeth, the skull cap, or the thigh bone? Well, it's none of the above. You can't figure out what the nose would have looked like. You really can't figure out really well the shape of the eyes. You can definitely do some work around the eyebrows and things like that from what was found. But again, the full scope of the shape of the jaw, the full scope of the nose, the skin coloring, the hair coloring, so many things. There are so many liberties that have been taken that could not be attributed to a skull cap, 3 teeth, and a thigh bone. And that was Chesterton's criticism 100 years ago. Was we've just allowed it to pass. And really what you find from Java Man are some interesting findings, but they're not nearly as interesting as the picture. And the picture is what we're taught. The analogy that you made between the crucifixion and that, and I think it's a great analogy from the perspective, I think it really makes the point that we're trying to make here. So if we're trying to prove that evolution is true, can you get to the drawing? Because the drawing is really what makes the point, not necessarily the bones. So can you get to the drawing based on what you've found? No. Can you get to a picture of the crucifixion like this one? Can you get to a picture of the crucifixion based on what we know historically? Yes. Because we know, for example, historically, we know, number one, Jesus was a real person. Number two, we know that he was scourged by the Romans and then crucified. We know based on multiple independent sources in the Gospels. And again, there are 4 different books in the Gospels. I know today we've wrapped them all up in one Bible, but there are 4 independent sources written at the time. Eyewitness testimony at the time puts Jesus between 2 thieves, two other criminals who have been crucified, one on either cross, and Jesus in the middle. We know that Jesus, we know approximately when he lived. We know from Roman historians We know from Jewish historians, if you want to throw out the Bible historians like Luke and the other eyewitnesses who were there, we know from outside sources and sources within the Bible that Jesus was crucified by Pontius Pilate somewhere right around 30 to 33 AD. We know what crucifixion looked like. We know that the Romans would have beaten him severely and scourged him. We know all of these various things. So what don't we know about Jesus? Well, we don't exactly know how long his hair was. We don't for sure know, again, what his eyes would have looked like or anything else. But the message that we're trying to convey when you see a picture of the crucifixion is you have a man named Jesus on the cross. This is what crucifixion looked like, and this is what he suffered and died for you. Can you accurately depict all of those things? Yes. Can you make an argument that we don't really know about the shape of his face or the color of his eyes or the how much hair he had? Can you make that argument? Yeah, you can. But does that at all take away from the truth of the overall point? The important point here being Jesus died on the cross, crucified by the Romans 2,000 years ago. No, you can easily get to all of that from historical sources. So the important part is intact. The important part is easily established. It's a few minor details around the edges that we just don't know. When you look at Java Man, the important part is supposed to be showing how these fossils that were found purport to support Darwin's theory of evolution. And I would absolutely make the argument that the fossils that were found, the 3 teeth, the skull cap, and the thigh bone, do not provide nearly as much support as what we are constantly told that they do. The picture provides an enormous amount of support, but you can't really build the picture without making a whole lot of assumptions that really aren't there from the fossils themselves. And that's the point in all of this. So again, that's not what we're really looking to address in Jesus' crucifixion. You've got the historical points. You've got the main things that you can fall back on and go, yes, history confirms those for us. We feel solid on those things. Do we know how long his hair was? Not really. But that's okay. That's not the point. The whole point of the Java Man is that it attempts to show what that picture supports. And you can't get to that picture. Again, in my opinion, you cannot get to that picture based on the fossil record shown. Can you get to that jawline? You could argue the size of the teeth and a few other things. But again, there's enormous liberties that have been taken in questions that we just don't have answers to. It's the drawing that makes the point. And there's a lot of things that we can't know. So are they drawing the picture based on the assumption that evolution is true? Yes. But part of the foundational evidence for evolution being true is the bones that they're drawing a picture of. So again, it becomes circular reasoning. And that's the whole point Chesterton was making 100 years ago. And I think it's a point that we have to respect today. Okay, and what I want to wrap up with is one last piece of this that we're talking about here is the Miller-Urey experiment. And again, I want to quote from the reader, and I think, again, we're missing the bigger picture here, and I want to really expand on it because I didn't spend a lot of time on this in looking at this back here a few episodes ago. Okay, I want to read from the viewer who sent this in. I don't think you're properly grasping what the Miller-Urey experiment represents even today. I'll use what you skim past here as the coup de grace that I meant to defend, that the Miller-Urey experiment wasn't accurate to early Earth conditions. I grant that. I can say that the experiment proved that amino acids can be formed from non-living material in the right conditions. That's something that you cannot deny. Another thing you cannot deny is that the subsequent experiments with corrected early Earth chemistry that came to similar results. That is, they also formed amino acids. The theory is good, or at least you're not inclined in this video to give your best as to why it isn't. Okay, fair enough. So I'm not going to quote from any, I'm going to quote from some people who are far smarter than I am on this topic. And I want to address a couple of points that the reader made. Number one, and I want to go to Stephen Meyer's book, The Return of the God Hypothesis, because I think this sums up the point so very well of what we're talking about. Origin of life researchers now know that Miller's simulation experiment has little, if any, relevance to explaining how amino acids, let alone their precise sequencing, necessary to produce proteins, could have arisen in the actual atmosphere of the early Earth. And I want to expand on this by going back to one of my favorite quotes, Fred Hoyle, who was, again, looking at this, and Hoyle stumbled upon the beginnings of the fine-tuning argument back 50 years ago. And Hoyle addresses something very similar in talking about this. Life cannot have had a random beginning. The trouble is that there are about 2,000 enzymes, and the chances of obtaining them all in a random trial is only 1 part in 10 to the 40,000th power. 40,000th power. Can you imagine that number? Again, when we think about number of atoms in the universe, 10 to the 80th power. This is 10 to the 40,000th power. It's just a number that's unreal. An outrageously small probability that could not be faced even if the whole universe consisted of organic soup. What Hoyle is starting to get at, and didn't really fully understand even back then, although we're starting to get there, and what Stephen Meyer is expanding on here, is that even if the Miller-Urey experiment had gotten it right, it's irrelevant. It doesn't matter. The problem is, even if you can get some basic building blocks, you have to put those building blocks together in just the right way to start forming proteins and all of these other things to actually start putting together and building a basic cell. Even if Miller had been right, which he wasn't, and I want to finish that here in a moment, it's so utterly irrelevant for what we've determined and figured out as it relates to the cell. It takes intelligence to put together all of these various different pieces and parts. Even if you get the enzymes, even if you start to get some random things, what we know is they have got to be put together in just the right way. And whether you're talking the RNA world, or whether you're talking DNA, or whether you're talking about how all of this goes, what we're learning, the really ironic part in all of this is, in the 1950s, as the Miller-Urey experiment was going on, you had the discovery of DNA. And what Crick discovered in terms of DNA utterly makes the Miller-Urey experiment irrelevant, because what we found is the massive amount of information contained in DNA that produces us has to be accounted for somehow. And what we know from our information-driven society, what we know from our computers, what we know from everything is, information does not now, nor does it ever, just randomly form. Now you can get complex, semi-complex, crystal formations or things like that. But what you cannot get is information truly coming together. Like, for example, if I had a bowl of cereal with little letters in it, and I was looking at that cereal, and I noticed the cereal floating around, and it made, A, N, D came together. I was like, hey, look, the word and came together in my bowl. That's awesome. Is that proof that evolution is true? No, it's proof that every once in a while you get a little bit lucky in that regard. But if I look down into my cereal bowl and I saw, good morning, Ron, have a great day today, spelled out in the letters in my cereal, even as remarkable as that might be to find, obviously that pales in comparison when we think about things like the DNA that's inside of us. We talked about Richard Dawkins and his evolutionary algorithm a few episodes ago, and how it's just, without injecting intelligence into it, you're never going to be able to account for the information that's inside of us. And we walked all the way through that. Again, I would reference you back to our episodes a few weeks ago looking at that particular topic. This is going to be very much the same way. Even if the Miller-Urey experiment had been right, and it wasn't, it's still never going to account for the information that's necessary to take those amino acids, to take those proteins, and do something with them. So it's irrelevant, and that's the hard part, is we're still shown that the Miller-Urey experiment is important. And again, the viewer who wrote this in, passionately, you can tell, believes that what's in there is important. But even if Miller had gotten it exactly right, we know enough now about the information encoded inside of us to say, so what? It still doesn't provide a pathway that can get us there. And even things like the RNA world theory and things like that, again, the only way this works is to inject intelligence into the process to get us to a point where things can start to organize, or really realistically be organized, to start forming the complex items, the cells that make up us. I also want to address, he said in here that that you can actually get to formed amino acids, looking at the corrected Earth's chemistry. I want to address something from Lee Strobel's book, The Case for a Creator. And Strobel was interviewing Jonathan Wells, a PhD in molecular and cellular biology. He asked him that question. Strobel said, "What happens if you replay the experiment using an accurate atmosphere?" And the answer, I think, might be interesting to you. "I'll tell you this," and this is Jonathan Wells responding. "I'll tell you this, you do not get amino acids. That's for sure," he replied. "Some textbooks fudge by saying, well, even if you use a realistic atmosphere, you still get organic molecules, as if that solves the problem." He goes on later to identify the molecules: formaldehyde and cyanide. The idea that using a realistic atmosphere gets you to the first step in the origin of life is just laughable. And I think, as we all know, formaldehyde and cyanide, not friendly to life. So while you do get some organic molecules, you do not get the amino acids that Miller was hoping for in the experiment. So when we look at all of this, and again, I want to credit the reader, the viewer who wrote in, for asking some good questions and doing some things like that. And I think there's always this assumption, if you would just read The Origin of Species, you would understand. And I have read The Origin of Species. Darwin, like I said, is really fascinated by this patch of dirt in his backyard and pigeons and some other birds and things like that. And I really want you as the viewer to understand, I have done my homework on this. And I have spent a lot of time digging through these materials because, again, what I've been taught my whole life is the idea that evolution is settled science, that evolution is true. How can you possibly question evolution? But the amazing thing is, when you look at each one of the pillars that we're taught, this idea that evolution is settled science, whether it's the tree of life or the Miller-Urey experiment, whether it's Haeckel's embryos or whether it's homology. Again, homology can prove lots of different things. It could prove a common ancestor, but it can also prove a common designer. Or Java Man, or the living missing links. All of these ideas that Darwin's theory is built on this solid foundation, none of it's really true. There are holes all over the place. And again, I'm going to credit the viewer who wrote in. He provided a lot of good answers to the problems, and he went and researched it, and he found answers, or he knew the answers to some of these problems. But the interesting thing is, the fact that there are answers to some of the problems, potentially, again, Darwin provided 4 answers to the problem of living missing links, and none of them are actually satisfactory. Haeckel's embryos, the viewer in question went, yeah, he basically said, okay, I'm not going to even argue that point. When you look at the idea of homology, he mentioned in here, I think it would absolutely blow your mind to see what atheists have to say about these things. Textbooks aren't written to tackle every tiny nitpick from every rapidly shrinking community with a vested interest in not believing in evolution. Little dig there. This may be shocking to you, but I really, in looking at this, am just trying to dig through the scientific evidence that's available. And increasingly, the holes that are in Darwin's theory require an explanation, demand an explanation from us. And it's not good enough to just look at it and say, well, it's settled science. I understand that textbooks don't necessarily dig this deep. Oh, that I wish they would. But I think what textbooks could do is to present the discussion in a little bit more fair context, somewhere along the lines of, well, this is Darwin's theory, but these are a lot of the problems that we know today. And in the weeks to come, we're going to spend a lot more time talking about these problems and unpacking these problems. I hope that you'll continue with us in the weeks to come. I really hope you'll stick with us as we make this journey, because again, the strength of the argument is made in the long journey. I don't know that there's any one silver bullet that gets us all the way to the end of the argument. I think there are some arguments you could make. The entire universe coming from nothing, that's a tough one. Fine-tuning is enough of an argument that even Richard Dawkins is starting to question and go, well, that's the pretty good. If you were going to make an argument for a creator's existence, that's a pretty good one to start around. As you look at all of these things, I think what you'll find is, ironically, modern scientific discoveries are increasingly casting doubt on Darwin's theory. And that is the ironic part. I think if you looked 100 years ago and you asked most scientists, they would have said 100 years from now, the biblical theory of creation, or this idea of a God, will be so long gone that no one will ever look back on it as anything other than, some ancient mythology. And yet here we find ourselves today looking at the search for a creator and recognizing that the hand of an intelligent creator, an intelligent designer, may be the best possible explanation for how we got ourselves here. I love this quote from Malcolm Muggeridge, the great journalist of the 20th century, one of the great journalists of the 20th century. He said, "I am myself convinced that the theory of evolution, especially to the extent to which it has been applied, will be one of the greatest jokes in the history books of the future. Posterity will marvel that so flimsy and dubious a hypothesis could be accepted with the incredible credulity it has." And I guess I would point out, I would ask you, the viewer, as you're looking at this and as you're thinking about it, as this scientific evidence points out, I think about Frank Turek, and a lot of times he asks the question, if Christianity were true, would you become a Christian? And it's funny the number of people who say, yeah, no, I don't think so. And it's such an interesting conundrum because I don't know if they fully think through what that means. So if Christianity was true, that means that God actually exists, that he took on human form in the person of Jesus Christ, that he died on the cross for our sins, not only to show us how much he loves us, but to pay the price for our sin debt and to reconcile us back to heaven with him, to spend eternity with him. And if that was true, would you become a Christian? A lot of people say, yeah, no, I'm not really sure. I don't think I would, which is amazing to me, because if you knew that was true and you openly rejected it, what an interesting statement and what an interesting place to be. I think as we look at this, I'm tempted to ask the question, I quoted from Richard Dawkins, I think in the last episode, that, if all of the scientific evidence turned to favor creationism, I think Dawkins said something along the lines of, I would be the first to admit it and become a creationist. But it doesn't, and, all of the available evidence points towards evolution. I want to ask that question, I guess, of you, the viewer. If the increasing weight of the evidence out there supports the idea that an intelligent designer is the best explanation for how we got here, so much so that the likelihood of naturalism begins to fade into obscurity, just dwarfed by the odds, would you accept that? At what point is enough evidence enough? And I want to leave you with that thought as we go forward. There ought to be an answer, I think, for everybody, that at some point, enough evidence should be enough. And what is that place for you? So think about that and think about what might be holding you back. I hope you enjoyed this week's episode. If you did, I hope you'll consider hitting the like button for this week's episode and the subscribe button for the podcast. You can find our podcast here on YouTube, iTunes, or Spotify. You can find us on our website at prooftograce.com, or you can find us and reach out to us via email at prooftograce@yahoo.com. I hope you'll consider continuing with us on this journey, and I hope you're having a good time. Thank you so much for joining us, and I look forward to seeing you in the weeks to come. Bye-bye.